Alrighty, I think we're ready to get going. Alrighty, you ready? All right, so I guess I'll just sort of introduce the event as a whole. ACM Hack, we're gonna have a passion talk today, week 7, and it's going to be on web accessibility. By the way, just a logistical issue. We don't have any mics or speaker system, so I'm gonna raise my voice up a little bit. Can you guys hear me in the back?
Yeah.
We're all good? Alrighty, awesome. Cool, so let's just get started. The attendance code is A11Y if you guys want to punch it into the ACM website. I think I'll wait maybe about 30 seconds. Don't want to keep you guys from some credit. Already A11Y. And if you guys ever want to ask questions, feel free to scan the QR code. This is going to be a Slido. So you can basically anonymously ask questions. You don't have to do it in person. If there's something that's really bothering you, something that you really want an answer to, you can do it like this, or you can just feel free to shout out pretty much anytime throughout the talk. Alrighty, everybody got the Slido? Let's get going. So this is going to start a little bit differently. I'm actually going to ask you guys to close your eyes. And we're going to play a sound. It's not going to be music. It's not going to be anything pretty. But we're going to play a sound, and then you guys guess what it is. So just close your eyes.
Thursday, link, and leaving the list 12, link, and of list. Leaving group landmark, entering main landmark, frame 2. Heading level 2.
Alrighty, that's about enough. Do you guys have a guess? You can open your eyes now. The answer is, this is actually a New York Times article. And I guess more specifically, this is a New York Times article for the perspective of a what's called a screen reader. This is something that parses an HTML page and then sort of tells you what it is that you're seeing. You can navigate the page through that. This is actually what people with visual impairments use. Usually people who are legally blind use to actually navigate the internet. So I want you guys to sort of think, if you had to use this for, let's say, a week, what would that look like? Let's say that everything, for example, that's using web technology, so like Chrome or any app built on web technologies, just had a black screen, and all you had to interact with it was a screen reader. I want you to think, what that might look like a week in that life, and also sort of extend it to the rest of your life, right? If this was non-ending, how would that impact you? Your socioeconomic status, how would that impact your job selection, and so on? Just a thought to keep on the back of your mind as your mind sort of dozes off here. A quick introduction from me. Hi, everybody. My name is Omar. I am a third-year computer science major at UCLA. I am a web enthusiast, an occasional chess player, sort of, that's debatable. And I'm actually an incoming web engineer intern at Robinhood. Now, roughly 2 years ago, I actually thought of an idea to build this tool. I thought of something that, sort of parses an essay that you might have for school or for a college essay, let's say. And it picks out overused words and sort of recommends alternatives, recommends synonyms. And so I built it. This was a cute little tool that I built called Synonymy. I eventually realized that there are a lot of unforeseen challenges to building something like this. So it was basically discontinued shortly after. But one of the things that I got from it was this PR not too long after I uploaded it on GitHub. Now, this sort of confused me at first. It reads, added alts to tutorial images and updated anchors with rel no opener. Now, half of this is actually not something that I'm going to focus on. It's a little bit of web development jargon. But the first half of it sort of confused me. You see, it says added alts to tutorial images. So this was a single page web application. So you really couldn't get this case right here. This is what I understood alt images to be. Alt text for images. Right. So when you have an image that's broken, maybe the source is different. This is what I thought alt text was. And I didn't know it at the time, but this was actually my first introduction to web accessibility. Now, I guess before I explain what it is, a quick roadmap. This talk shouldn't take too long. I'm guessing around 40 minutes. We're essentially going to go over a few things here. We're going to go over what it is specifically in detail. We're going to talk about, more importantly, why you should care, right? The motivations behind web accessibility, why it's important to know, regardless of whether or not you're a web developer. I'm going to keep it as general as possible because web accessibility really is something that I think everybody should know if you're a contributor to anything on the web, i.e. everybody. Number 3, we're going to talk about what makes a web page application, web content in general, accessible. Number 4, we're going to talk about what the future holds. I'm mostly going to talk about some trends that I see and sort of extrapolate that in the future. This is not going to be really scientific. This is just going to be where I see web accessibility going in the future. And then finally, some key takeaways and resources. This section is going to be really short, just a quick brief send-off with some tools that I think are really useful. All right, without further ado, let's get started with what web accessibility is. Now, Wikipedia has this definition that I think is extremely accurate. So I'll read it to you right now. They define it as the inclusive practice of ensuring there are no barriers that prevent interaction with or access to websites on the World Wide Web by people with physical disabilities, situational disabilities, and socioeconomic restrictions on bandwidth and speed. Now, as accurate as I think this is actually really wordy and I think kind of overblown definition. So I'm actually going to give you a different definition here. Making the internet accessible to all. This is really what this boils down to. And then that sort of begs the question, well, what is all, right? We really have to gain an understanding of this. And that really boils down to what I argue is around 5 main categories that you can keep as distinct. The first is people with visual impairments. So this is going to be people who are blind as well as partially sighted. Color blindness also falls into this category. Next, we're going to have the category of auditory impairment. So people who are deaf or need hearing aids. Very commonly, this is an age-based disability as well. Very likely something that we're going to deal with within our lifetime. Motor impairments. So this is somebody who, for example, isn't able to use a mouse, right? So not everybody is able to use a mouse. Some people have to use a keyboard just by necessity. So this is going to be that group mainly in the context of web accessibility. Next is cognitive impairments. This is going to be everything from somebody who's on the spectrum, but is also somebody with a history of epilepsy or seizures. So this is a pretty broad category as well. And then finally, this might surprise some of you, socioeconomic status. This is what was alluded to in the Wikipedia definition, actually. So we'll sort of talk about how each of these play into the web as a whole. Now we get to our second portion, the why should I care part, which in my opinion is the most important one. It's why we have so few people in here is because it's very difficult to sell web accessibility. It's not a particularly sexy topic, unfortunately. But I'm going to do my best to show that it is. Firstly, everything has moved online, and I'm sure I'm not the first one to say this. I'm not making a profound statement here. Everybody knows this, right? Everything has moved online, and I genuinely do mean this. When's the last time you went to the physical alternative of any of these services, right? Except for Canvas, right? But that's only been an issue for the last year, right? Now, imagine that you didn't have access to these. it's a really simple thought, but I think it's relatively profound, right? What if all of these tools that are online, you no longer had access to, or you had limited access to? And this brings me to the effects of web accessibility issues that we see today. Roughly 98% of home pages have web accessibility violations. This is home pages, guys, not entire websites, not entire web applications. Just this is index.html we're talking about, right? And I want you to imagine if it's 98% for the homepage, what is it for the website as a whole? And I want you to think of the effect of this. Unfortunately, it's very predictable. This is a sort of this is a statistic that really sort of breaks my heart. 23% of disabled people never go online. And you might be thinking, well, when is this data collected, right? Let me check actually. This is September 10th, 2021 from the Pew Research Center. So this is 2 months ago, right? This isn't something that's really old. A very, very large portion of the disabled population have just decided, because of web accessibility issues, to just not use the internet. And with this, once again, very predictable, those with disabilities make 87 cents to the dollar compared to those without disabilities. Right, and it's something that I unfortunately believe will get worse as we go on. And just to give a sense of scale, more than 1 billion people experience some form of disability, according to the World Health Organization. Now, another sort of seldom talked about point is also the point of internet speed, right? We're in a first world country. Our internet is, really fast. Obviously, there's Korea and Japan and these other outliers. But, contextually speaking, globally, our internet is extremely fast, but this doesn't go for every country and not even every neighborhood in the US. And that's something that I want to stress. 20% of people in advanced economies and 65% of people in developing economies don't have access to high-speed internet, right? And once again, this is really recent data, I believe 2020. So when you build tools, when you put out online content, I want you to keep these in mind. And a quick word on web accessibility as it relates to the law. There's actually a Americans with Disabilities Act section, not necessarily related to it, but impacting web accessibility. This is specifically Title III. And this is basically the only tool that people with disabilities have in counteracting, poor web accessibility, right? This is, if your business has a product or service that disproportionately, negatively affects people with disabilities and not providing services to them, that's discrimination, and it genuinely can be a serious issue if you're planning on making a business. Secondly, in there is a term, places of public accommodation. Initially, I believe this was in the 1990s. This has really, just through precedent, has expanded to include web services as well. So you might say, well, my business is completely online. There's no physical place of accommodation, and that doesn't necessarily apply in some circuits. So that's something to be careful about. And one more thing that I want to touch on, there's a very common defense for this in the law, which is the telephone number defense. Basically saying, we have a telephone number. If you can't access our website, use that. But how many of you really think that this is a good alternative, especially today, when it's almost impossible to actually get in touch with a human being and talk to a human being? You're almost always directed to a robot, or ironically directed to the website. Next, I want to talk about web accessibility being good for business. Now, what the previous slide was, I think, reason enough, but there are actually more, in my opinion, more compelling reasons, right? First is innovation. Now, when you hear innovation, this is one of those terms that are sort of thrown around in corporate America, maybe up there with synergy. That just doesn't mean anything. It's really disingenuous. But I mean this genuinely, right? Web accessibility, if you really focus on it as a business, will drive innovation. Right? A lot of tools like the telegraph, the telephone, even email, were initially conceived from this need of helping those with disabilities. So when you try to solve one problem, it might generalize in a way that you might not have expected before. Secondly, it's enhancing your brand. And this one, I think, goes without saying. But if you have poor web accessibility, people are going to notice. Even if you're not large enough to get lawsuits for it, people will notice, especially those with disabilities. Right? And I think, especially with consumers now, they're extremely focused on inclusion and are really conscious about what products and services they use. This is going to be a big one going forward. And next, extending market reach. Like I said, there are estimated 1 billion people with disabilities. It doesn't make sense to just cater to 85% of the population. I think this is a given. But for those who still aren't convinced, I think this is the nail in the coffin here. Next, I want to talk about page ranking. So you can see the old Google logo here. So we're talking about maybe around the early 2000s. There used to be an industry around figuring out what the Google algorithm was, right? Even back then, being ranked at the top of Google search for some keyword made a lot of people a lot of money, right? So people paid for this industry. And back then, there was really only one thing that determined it, and it's backlinks, right? So other websites would point to your website, and that would increase its ranking, right? And it was really simple. But I think a lot has changed since then, partially due to Google deciding to make a browser and collecting a lot more interesting data on user behavior. Now it's a lot more complicated, right? Now we have a lot more factors. I think 200 plus factors that determine a page ranking. These include bounce rate, dwell time, best practices, and web accessibility is actually one of them. This is also something that's explicitly built in to the Google PageRank algorithm. It also turns out that when you make your web page accessible, particularly for screen readers, right, for those with visual impairments, you also end up helping Google's bots scrape your website, basically, collect metadata, right? I'll get into how this might work in a little bit in the examples of this. Third, I want to talk about what makes a web page or a web application accessible. I'm going to keep this to web content just to keep it general, because this does apply to practically everything on the web. I'm going to split this by different types of disabilities. Firstly, I'm going to start with people with visual impairments, because the problems here are arguably the most profound. Let's start with this example. I'm actually not going to be talking about the human population, because I have honestly nothing to say about it. I don't do anything with demographics. Let's say we had a web page with this, right? So we have a simple heading, and we have some sort of graph, some chart that conveys meaning, right? The important keyword here is that conveys meaning. Right? We can't just say, hockey stick, right? This is what that might look like in code. In fact, this is what it does look like in code. I tried to keep it really simple, bar some of the styling and some of the metadata in the header. This is the code that brings this about. Okay. So we have in our body, we have a header, and then we have an image with a source pointing to where to get the image's data from. And then we have a class, which is basically to make it look a certain way. Now, all we have to do to change this is actually add an alt tag. This is what I was alluding to in the pull request that I've shown on my project. This is what the person recommended I do. And it makes sense, right? This is a description of the image that conveys the same meaning. And notice, this is something that I really want to stress, conveys the same meaning. It doesn't just describe what it is, right? I'll go a little bit more in depth into that, right? So instead of just doing nothing, we put alt text saying a chart of human population across time shows exponential growth after 1500 CE, right? And this is actually something that you can change not only as a web developer, but you can determine this if you're using any sort of content management system, right? If you're using, I believe, I'm not too sure which content management system this is. I think it is WordPress. You can actually, when uploading images, pass an alt text. This is almost ubiquitous in content management systems. If you put up something on your personal website, even if you're not a web developer, in my opinion, you should put alt text, right? Just not only describing what's on there, but that's something that carries the same purpose. And next, I'm going to talk about LinkedIn, and I think some other popular platforms are catching on as well. You can put alternate text on your images that you post, right? And I think this is something that we should take advantage of. Now, I want to get a little bit meta here. You can do this on Google Slides, right? You can right click and we have an option for alt text here, right? And I guess example 2 now, we have this sort of this web page. Once again, I'm keeping it really, really simple, just so we can keep it true to the source code, right? I really want to show you everything significant that there is. So we have this this header, this navigation section. We have around 5 links. We have a main content section, and then we have a footer here. Relatively simple layout. I'm sure you've seen this everywhere. I absolutely hate this layout. I don't know why it exists, but it does, and it's everywhere. But there's nothing I can do about it. This is the source code for it. Really simple. We have a body. We have 3 different containers, which are div elements. And inside of them, we have, let me see, the first one, we have our navigation section. So we have a list of items, which are anchor tags, which link to some page in our website. We have our main section, which holds the header and paragraph text. And then at the bottom, we have some paragraph text for the company. And then we have another link here. Now, this is actually going to take a lot of restructuring. I want you to really focus on this. And try to see how many things change, all right? This is going to be huge restructuring. You ready? That's it. That's all that has to change. I'll cycle through these. All that really changed is that we denoted which sections are which, right? So our navigation section is no longer a div. We're not saying it's just some container, some arbitrary unknown purpose container, right? We're saying this is our nav section. This is where our navigation elements are going to be. And secondly, the main content. This is actually the problem with what you heard. The New York Times article is it didn't have a main element. So somebody who had to just read the headline would have to go through an entire list of unrelated links, right? Because screen readers aren't humans. They can't just immediately see what the main content is. They have to cycle through these without any semantic HTML. When you don't explicitly say what different sections are, right? And then we have the footer, relatively self-explanatory. Instead of div, we use footer. There are a lot of these semantic HTML elements. You might have seen them. You might have wondered why they exist. This is why. And once again, WordPress, a really powerful CMS. You don't have to be a web developer for this to be useful. This is one of the things that I'm trying to convey. This has semantic HTML options, right? So when you're creating sort of component, I'm not too sure with WordPress, but you can specifically denote, okay, I want this section to be denoted with this title. Next section. One thing that I do want to make clear is this is not all of the web accessibility requirements. This is just some of them that I think are most important. Next, we're going to talk about auditory impairments. So I want you to think of this this podcast here. It could be about anything. It really doesn't matter. This one I've concocted in my head is about cheese for some reason. But we have this podcast, point is, and this is the source code. We have our body. This time we have our main section, which is an improvement. But now we have this audio element. And now, if you think about it, you know, how does somebody who has auditory impairments, who's deaf, access this, right? And this one's actually really simple. Just include a section that is sort of description of what you talk about, right? You can have this transcribed yourself. You can painstakingly go and sort of change, determine what exactly is being said and then write it out. Or you can do this with an AI, just drag and drop. There are actually a lot of these services. I think Rev is the most popular, which also does captioning for videos as well. It's just something to keep in mind so that you can automate this. Example 2, a training video. This has both visual and auditory components, but we're going to be talking about the auditory component for now. Okay, this is the source code. It's going to be just a header, and we're going to have a video file this time. If you guys aren't familiar with video and audio elements, don't worry. There's a lot of great documentation on MDN. Something I'm sure if you're in web development, you're going to be using a lot. And the change is this. This might seem pretty big. There's a track element that's provided. All you have to do is just point to the, I think, .vtt extension. So once again, this can be something provided by a service like Rev, right? This usually provides an endpoint. You can just drag and drop into that. This will give you an endpoint, put it in source, and you're good to go. And this is something that you can do with YouTube as well. I think YouTube ended their AI captioning system. I might be wrong, but that's really unfortunate. As terrible as it was, it was at least some way to get an idea of what was going on in a video. But you can do this yourself, right? Not particularly fun, but I think if you're conveying something that should be heard by everybody, I think this is a good step. Next, we're going to talk about motor impairments. Now, this is going to be AKA people who can't use a mouse. This is almost always what this is, with a case of oversimplifying slightly. But I think this is how you can think of it. If I go to, for example, let me try Facebook. Hopefully I don't have anything too strange on my wall. Okay, if I go and want to, let's say I'm not going to use my trackpad. All I'm going to use is tab and shift. You ready? I'm going to start clicking tab. We go through these options, and if I click shift and tab, we're going to go back, right? Now I could do this for hours. I'm a pretty boring person, but I'm not going to. I think from here, we can, for example, go to this dropdown. We can click enter, right? And if I click tab a bunch of times, we're going to be focused in on this section, right? And if I want to get out, I can click escape, right? So what Facebook engineers have done is nothing groundbreaking. All they've done is they paid attention to how their website functions when only using keyboard, right? So I can go here, setting, click enter. I can, I don't know, there's really nothing I do on Facebook, so I don't know what I would want to do. But I can go through here, click tab, and really go through everything that I would want, right? This is an example of how to make things accessible for people with motor impairments, right? Make it so that people can access your website. Really simple. Now you might say, well, how do I do that? I'll actually open up just my personal website. This is something I built in like, I think a day. Literally, I think I wrote it down here. But the idea here is that this is not something that you have to explicitly worry about, right? So I can go through here. I have not spent a single minute worrying about keyboard accessibility, but this is accessible. So what I'm trying to say is just check once in a while, if you're building a website, whether or not you can do everything that you would want to do, right? This is just something that you should have in the back of your mind as a precaution, because sometimes you might create what's called a keyboard trap, and that's what I'll go into in a minute. We have this website, right? Once again, we're going with the theme of 1990s. One thing that I do want you to know from here is that whoever tried to make this tried to make it so that if you try to get to the social media, if you try to focus on that with a keyboard and click enter, it'll open it in a new tab, right? This is the prodrome, the backstory to this, right? Let's look at what this does in action. I click tab, I click tab again. Uh-oh. Now this actually isn't an actual HTML element, so this points to something pointless. But if I try accessing this this scholarship's apply now button, I can't, right? Now I could actually go backwards and okay, I actually can't go backwards, never mind. So this is actually what's called a keyboard trap. You've essentially trapped the user and aren't allowing them to focus on a certain element in the page, right? You're only explicitly allowing somebody to apply that is using a mouse and able to use a mouse. And we're going to talk about how that might go about. I want you to, for any web developers here, sort of spot where the issue is, right? So I'm not going to dwell on this too long. I'm not too sure everybody here has experience with HTML. By the way, by show of hands, how many people here have used HTML before? Those in the back, HTML? Have you guys used it? Okay, everybody, we're good then. So I'll be spending a little bit more time on this. I don't want to go through this too quickly. The problem here is actually a very, very small distinction here, right? Once again, the motivation behind this is when we focus over social media and click enter, we want to open up in a new tab. right? The issue with this is that we have this on key down event, which on its own does exactly what it says, right? When we're focused on this, when we press a key, it's going to open up in a new tab. And that's the important distinction here, right? If we click tab, it's going to open this new tab. It's not going to allow us to navigate the website as we would. The difference here is actually really, really subtle. It's on key press instead of on key down. This is not something they have to memorize. Just keep in mind that when you're dealing with keyboard, with these keyboard events, to really look at the documentation well, particularly focus on tab, shift, and escape. That's going to be the most important ones for keyboard accessibility. Alrighty, cognitive impairments. This is going to be, now, first of all, I want to say that this is a topic that a lot of people sort of try to avoid, but I really want to dissuade you from doing that. This is actually a really important topic. It's something that you should not walk on eggshells around. So just want to state that. First off, simplicity is key. So this means using pictures, symbols along with text. If we're going back to Facebook, if we go back to, let's say, the homepage, everything here, right? Everything here is extremely simple, like extremely well put together. Is icons next to short text, right? It's really concise. And another thing that I want to pull your attention to is actually the text, right? It's extremely simple. You don't have any extraneous text that doesn't need to be there. Everything conveys meaning, right? You don't have any sort of sentences describing something. It's just what it is specifically, and it doesn't go off track, right? When describing the button or the functionality. Consistent navigation and design on every page, uncluttered and simple screen layout, right? This is self-explanatory. I know this might seem sort of strange. Well, what does that exactly mean? You'll know the opposite when you see it. So, and use larger fonts. This is going to be, sweet spot is usually 12 to 14 point. I'm not too sure what that is in REM, so I'd have to look that up. And no blinking and flashing lights for obvious reasons, right? I'm not going to get into that. And essentially just avoid this, right? You're going to want to keep it really simple, really minimal. Try to use icons along with text, simple text, right, at that. And yeah, this is one thing that I want to focus on is, regardless of whether or not you're a developer, you can contribute to this, right? So if you're a designer, somebody who's a UI UX developer particularly, this is something that you should take into account especially, right? Next, accommodating for slow internet. The biggest thing here is actually load time. It's really simple. It's how fast is your web application, web content. We'll keep it general. How fast does it load on somebody's device, right? And you can actually test for this in the Chrome Dev Tools. I think you can simulate like 3G and see how long it takes for your website web application to load. Firstly, I think everybody here knows HTML. I'm presuming most of you are web developers here. If you're using some sort of library system, maybe you're using Webpack or something, and then compiling that down to something that runs on the browser, you're probably using code that other people have written, right? So if you use React, if you use anything that is a framework, you're probably using this. And the point here is remove ones you don't need, right? If there's a library that you had a long time ago that's really bloating your bundle size that you're not using, just remove that. Or if you're using something once, and you can definitely do that by hand, that's much simpler, do take the time to do that. Secondly, take advantage of tree shaking. I'll actually get into what this is specifically. So yeah, I won't dwell on this too much. Do click on this resource if you ever get these slides. Third, lazy load portions of your website. This is especially a problem with progressive web applications. So if you're using something like Create React App, you're probably not going to be lazy loading portions of your website. What I mean by that is you're going to be loading a single page web application, everything at once, right? Nothing is going to be rendered until all of the JavaScript is loaded, and then it's going to be rendered on the client side, right? We want to not necessarily avoid that, but we want to minimize the amount of JavaScript we load. Or yeah, that's mostly what it is for progressive web applications. And lastly, watch your bundle size. I'll actually share a tool with this. It's called Bundlephobia. I mean, I think it's a pretty apt name, sort of describes what it is. If you're in the JavaScript ecosystem, which I'm assuming you are, if you're a front-end web developer, use this tool, right? If you have multiple packages that you're considering, throw both of these in, see how big they are. More importantly, see what the download time is, right? I believe a majority of the world still is in 3G. So maybe just a package like Lodash, which I'm sure some of you have used, this adds a half a second, right? So it's not insignificant. So when using these, do check them. And one thing that's actually going to nullify what I just said is something called tree shaking. Now, instead of just using the bundle size to determine what packages you should use and how you should use them, you should also look at whether or not they use something called tree shaking. What this means is, if you look at this example from a library called Lodash, which is, I think, the most popular JavaScript library there is, we're using this relatively straightforwardly, right? We import underscore from Lodash, or import Lodash from Lodash. I think if you're British, you'd call this a Lodash. Don't do this, right? Import what you need. Use this syntax. This basically tells Webpack or Rollup or V or whatever bundler you're using, hey, I want exactly this code. Put this into my bundle. Don't put everything that I'm not going to use into, right? Next, route level lazy loading. Some things you can do explicitly, but in my opinion, if you're at the very start of a project and need something that's accessible to those with slow internet, consider one of these frameworks, right? For React.js, that's Next.js. For Angular, that's Angular Universal. For Vue, that's something called Nuxt, I believe, which is a very strange name. Use one of these tools, right? I think a lot of these are extremely popular. So especially for Next.js is becoming the new norm as opposed to something like Create React App. These will ensure that if somebody goes to say your About Us section or something like that, right? Some static section, it doesn't have to load an entire app to see that, right? This only loads what it needs to based on the page that you're visiting. This can be server-side rendered, or this can be, I think, pre-hydrated is the term. And secondly, lazy loading components. I alluded to this. If you have a component that's using some really large library that you can't pre-shake, or you have a component that's really adding to the bundle size, consider lazy loading it. Right? Look at the documentation. React, Angular, I'm sure Vue has it. Every major framework should have a section in their documentation called code splitting or lazy loading. Do take a look at that. Number 4, what's the future hold? Firstly, I want to talk about the complexity of websites. Now, actually, today got some of my Python skills up and actually scraped the web to see what things were like using the Wayback Machine. And so I really took, I think, like 2 hours to build the script. I hope you like it. Right? So we have, I'm not too sure if you guys know, but a long time ago, around 20 years ago, all the internet really was just an HTML page that linked to other HTML pages, right? Really simple. This was pre-JavaScript, right? Back when there were no specifications for a scripting language, this was really, really simple, right? And with that, you got really small bundle sizes. Things loaded quicker, even though the internet then was a lot slower, right? And then we have something like Facebook that really came from the dawn of something called cookies, which is basically the server being able to remember who you are, being able to personalize an HTML page that's sent to you and hydrate it based on who you are, basically. And then we have something like Figma, which is a culmination of a lot of different technologies. This one is WebAssembly, particularly giving you like a really fast interface to design things. And there are a lot of different ones that I can get into, WebGL, building 3D animations and so on. I honestly don't know everything that there is out there. There's just a lot of cool tools and gadgets out there. Point is, things are getting more complicated, and with that, bundle sizes are increasing. So this is one of the trends that I do want you to focus on. In general, the trend is that everything is getting larger, right? Everything is becoming, unfortunately, slower to load for people who still have slow internet. So that's one of the things that I would expect to continue, unfortunately. Another trend is there are a lot of software developers right now, right? And so there are going to be a lot more in the future. So we really are looking at a sort of hockey stick graph here, where we're expecting a lot more software developers to be made a lot quicker, right? If we're using a sort of assembly line similarity here, right? Problem is that web accessibility is not in any of our curriculums. And another problem is that there is no one curriculum, right? We can't just go to, even if we had control of all university curriculums, that would only account for maybe 30–40% of developers, right? A large majority of web developers are either self-taught or they learn from online tools, right? Like Free Code Camp or Udemy. Right, so this is another trend that I would expect to continue, unfortunately. So this is something that we do have to keep an eye on. AI and machine learning. This is getting better, but unfortunately not nearly fast enough, right? We have a lot of facial recognition features, a lot of advances in image recognition. The issue is that a lot of these don't have the context of a web page, right? One thing that I sort of stressed before was when you have an image, the alt text should not only describe what it is, but it should convey the same meaning. It should do the same thing. It should have the same purpose, right? And that's just not something that AI has the ability to do for the time being, right? Maybe in a few decades, it can, really accurately display the intentions of, what the web page is about, really have context clues and, determine what everything is about. But the issue is extremely difficult to solve. And I know because I tried to. And another thing that you should keep in mind is keyboard accessibility is a lot more difficult to automate, right? So point is, AI is, as much as it's improving, it's not nearly ahead enough to be able to automate web accessibility. So this is still something that we need to be diligent about. Key takeaways and resources. Just one more slide. Sorry to keep you guys long. Some resources here. 18F checklist. This is basically going to be a really, really simple checklist of things that you should make sure before putting out web content. This is extremely simple, right? If you ever Google web accessibility, the first thing that you will come across is WCAG, WCAG. Do not click on that because that will scare you away, right? Use this instead. It's extremely simple, and more importantly, it's more realistic that you will follow this. And following some web accessibility guidelines is much better than others. Most likely, 90% of what you see on WCAG will not apply to what you're building. Right? Another resource, color contrast checker. Right? I think I talked about a few different visual impairments related web accessibility guidelines. This is another one that I also want to stress in the resources. Make sure your text has enough color contrast, right? I think there's a color contrast ratio of like 4.5 to 1, which I do not understand, but this is a tool that will help you understand it, right? That'll help you make sure, is this, whether or not you're a developer or just a UI developer, is this enough contrast for somebody with vision impairments to be able to read, right? Another thing is A11Y IDE or LA IDE. This is actually something that I'd built with a professor at CSUN. And by the way, if you do use this, let me know if it works or not, because I have not touched it in a while. But the idea is if you create unaccessible code, this will tell you, right? So if you have any sort of small front-end project, you can drag and drop it into this. I'm not expecting anybody to develop anything into this, right? But you can drag and drop and sort of click on, okay, what are the issues, right? This one's a very obvious one, but you might, for example, throw it in and figure out like, oh, maybe my input should have a label that's linked with HTML4, right? That's another one that I didn't go over, but this will tell you if you have any of those other issues. And finally, this is something that I've talked about previously, right? Is the business case for accessibility. I yoinked a lot of the things from here. Do check it out, right? Especially if when you go into industry, this is something that you should be sending to your project managers, your co-founders, CEOs. Send this to them, right? Make sure that they know that web accessibility is a good business decision, not just something weighing them down, right? Alrighty, now I think is a good time to check. Are there any questions? Does Google PageRank rank the accessibility of a web page? Do they show how many images have alt tags, or is it more detailed than that? You can use something called Google Lighthouse. This is actually this isn't necessarily using Google's algorithm. I think it's using something called Axe Core, which is a different algorithm. But basically, you can run this on your website. They have a Chrome extension. You can check, what are the issues that I'm getting, right? This will explicitly tell you. Another one of these issues. I already hope that helps. Where's a good ballpark to get load time to? This really depends. If your app or service is meant to be used by like affluent people, this was the case for an internship I had over the summer. I didn't necessarily have to care too much, which is an unfortunate thing, right? But if you have something that you want to be used worldwide, like Facebook, they're actually making a lot of advances in making their bundle sizes smaller by server-side rendering and live updating from the server without having to send any JavaScript. If you're a global company, this is something that you'd want to really make sure of. I don't want to give a ballpark, but for the sake of an answer, I will. If it's something that you want to use globally, make sure that through Bundlephobia that it doesn't take more than 5 seconds, right? Because there's a really high bounce rate over that. And last one, what is your opinion? What in your opinion is a good way we can incentivize people to develop for web accessibility? I don't think we can. And this might be strange coming from me after an entire presentation. I think this doesn't make sense unless you share why you want web accessibility with those who you report to, right? Once again, to your CEOs, your co-founders, your higher ups, express this, right? Say, web accessibility is an important business decision that we should be getting right? Because otherwise, if the business structure doesn't support it, it's most likely not going to be a lasting change. So one more thing to stress is do share this with your co-founders, this right here, business case for accessibility. And yeah, I think that was all the questions. Yeah.
How accurate are like the transcribers?
If we're judging from YouTube, not very good. But I haven't used Rev all too often. Unfortunately, there's an issue with accents. So if you have anybody speaking with an accent, it most likely will get it wrong. I think there are a lot of TikToks on Amazon Alexa that prove that. But I say, if somebody is speaking with just a traditional American or English accent, I think it's going to be pretty accurate. Gotcha. Any other questions? Alrighty, I think that's about it. I want to thank you guys for coming. And yeah. That's about it. That's all, folks.